Thank you for listening to Mormon Mental Health Podcast. This episode addresses the current environment our community faces with the atrocities directed at the Black community. We encourage you to donate to organizations to help bring equality to our community. Please donate to Black organizations including the NAACP and Black Lives Matters. To donate, please visit NAACP, that's NAACP.org, or blacklivesmatter.com. Thank you. The following is an audio production offered by Symmetry Solutions and shared with you by Mormon Mental Health Podcast.
Hello, everybody. This is Natasha Helfer Parker, and we typically do a Friday kind of Q&A type of format where we welcome audience questions that we can then address, and several of us will come on and do a panel addressing a question that comes in, and we continue to encourage you to do that. Today, we're going to approach things a little bit differently. I'm joined by Lisa Butterworth, one of my providers, who's in Boise, Idaho. So hello, Lisa. Nice to have you with me today. We have been, of course, very affected by the events that started with the murder of George Floyd this last week, and yet another case of police brutality that we have witnessed. That, of course, calls to our consciousness that there are many more examples of this that we don't witness, that aren't recorded, that happen on a fairly regular basis here in the United States of America, where we practice and live. And so, of course, like so many in our communities, we are just appalled and saddened and grossly saddened and very distressed, and want to be part of, the dialogue and the communication and coming at it from a mental health perspective, because that's what we are as a mental health and wellness center. We want to be addressing this from that lens. So given all of that, Lisa and I, both white women, are going to do our best to talk about this from our lane. And the lane that we are talking about is the white supremacy lane. And so we're going to be talking about a lot of concepts and ideas that hopefully can be helpful in the healing that needs to happen. And healing can only happen when triage and trauma is directly dealt with, and that surgeries happen and then healing can begin. And I think it is the job primarily of white people in this country to be on triage units and address many things that really have gone unaddressed for far too long. And we understand our own complicitness in that, and we want to be very clear in addressing that going forward. So we're doing this in the sense of mental health and well-being, because these issues of course, affect the Black community and the brown communities, but it also affects the white communities. Racism and white supremacy and these kinds of concepts and things that we'll be talking about today are like one of the people I interviewed yesterday, Dr. Misha McGriggs, are a disease. They are a disease, and they are affecting us in very pathological ways that lower all kinds of criteria that would have to do with mental health, relational health, spiritual health, community health. And so that's our goal in sharing this. So Lisa, I'll just let you kind of share any first few thoughts before we get started with what we thought we would talk about today.
Yeah, I think the first thing that we were talking about doing was reading the statement that we decided to do for Symmetry Solutions. And I think that just being a little bit vulnerable in stating how like, as white people, we really struggle to talk about race in ways that are productive and in ways that are helpful, and that we fail a lot too. And so in the process of writing this statement, we know it's important that we speak, and we also want to recognize that we'll probably fall short, and we're going to keep trying to speak and learn, and that we welcome feedback, and that like, it's really uncomfortable as a white person, knowing that we are probably coming from our privilege over and over again and failing again, and yet we're still going to keep trying. So this is what we wrote, and recognizing that there's still a lot of learning that we can do.
Yeah, thank you. So that is where we're going to start. We're going to start with what our best attempt, and this was a statement, or I guess a post, however you want to call it, that we as a team spent this week discussing at length at Symmetry Solutions, which is always wonderful when you can have a team of clinicians and people who are thoughtful and intentional and wanting to, get it right for one, and also just having a diverse, a white diverse perspective on, what's the best way we can go about this. So let's go ahead and just read this. So, and we're just going to take turns reading paragraphs, so you don't have to listen to one of our voices. And we'll have this up on our blog as well. Here at Symmetry Solutions, we have watched in horror as we witness the murder of George Floyd, especially in the context of an ongoing pattern that this crime represents in our country. We have also watched in horror as institutions in power continue to incite violence, police brutality, harassment of peaceful protesters, and the chronic silencing of voices of color, just to name a few. We are fiercely committed to anti-racism work and advocacy.
We have learned that identifying our social location is an important part of anti-racism work. To that end, it is important for us to acknowledge that a large percentage of our clients and providers come from a not very diverse Western North American Mormon background. We are continuing to educate ourselves through the writings, research, and classes given by therapists of color, and hope to point our readers toward this important work so that we can learn together.
Here we provide a quick summary of some of the things we are learning. Our hope is that by providing a summary, you will follow the links provided and learn more about this research.
Experiences of racism have a very serious negative impact on mental and physical health of Black Americans. 88% of Black Americans say they experience racism and see it as a serious problem. Experiencing racism results in increased levels of anxiety, depression, anger, and sadness. Research indicates that the painful effects of racism arise from feeling a loss of control, internalization, and not doing valuable activities to avoid the stress of racism.
Just as one example, most of us believe in the value of hard work, but because systematic racism does not reward equal work with equal rewards, a feeling of hopelessness and lack of control often results. Further, many messages embedded in the system tell the story.
Sorry.
Okay, little doggy. You mute yourself really fast, and then we can continue. Let's see, where was I with? Okay, so further, many messages embedded in the system tell the story that there is something wrong with the person. Either they didn't work hard enough or they didn't do something right, rather than acknowledging that the system is unfair. Both the unfairness of the system and the blame that gets directed at the person can result in that person avoiding the work they wanted to do and or potentially feeling like they are at fault. This type of situation can be a daily experience for many.
To further complicate the problem, there are many more obstacles for Black Americans in obtaining mental health services, including fewer Black clinicians, few clinicians trained in therapeutic anti-racism, and many white clinicians who actually increase the anxiety and stress of their Black clients. Specifically, many white counselors reinforce the system by ignoring or denying the experiences of racism as reported by their clients. Here at Symmetry Solutions, we are committed to being a part of the solution Black members of our community need from the mental health clinicians and wellness coaches.
And then we're going to be sharing some links that are both for helping white members of the community understand things like white privilege and what actionable things can be done by white allies. We will also be linking to lots of resources that are made available for Black members of the community that help them with coping strategies for living with racism. We understand that not a lot of people of color probably visit our website or our blog. We encourage white members of the community to read those resources for Black Americans as well, because that will help you become educated in the types of research that is available and the types of discussion that is being had about the effects of racism on Black members of our community. So really most of the resources that we're sharing are meant for white people, because that's usually, that's primarily who we serve. All right, so that's what will be posted on our blog. We are committed at Symmetry to be continuing to write and share resources throughout time. We don't want this to be a one-time event or a one-time kind of focus because of certain things that happen in the news at certain times. We think it's important to keep this problem at the forefront of our collective consciousness on an ongoing basis. So we are committed to continuing to write blogs and post resources that have to do with white supremacy moving forward. So what I'd like to do next, Lisa, is that, as my experience as a white person myself, decades ago, when I first ran into these comments like, everybody's a racist or everybody's part of white supremacy, I remember having my own white fragility response. That's a book we recommend, by the way, White Fragility. And my response was fairly typical of what you see from people who do not identify as racist or white supremacist. In our country, I think we have a very dark history, and those words tend to elicit visions for white members of the community of, organizations like the KKK or people who, very directly use racial slurs. And so if you're a white person who would never do such a thing or would not align yourself with, organizations that are very extreme, you consider yourself a non-racist and you consider yourself, somebody who doesn't discriminate against Black people, and you go along your world and you feel fine and you feel like a kind, generous person, which a lot of people like to identify as kind, generous people, especially religious people. So then when you're hit with these words or with these sentiments that, white people are participating in racist and white supremacy types of systems, that can be very jarring. And oftentimes white people get very defensive about those types of terms. So I'd like your thoughts and ideas about that, Lisa. And I'd also like to offer definitions of what these terms mean, because they really are not being used in the context of personal approaches. They're really being used in terms of systemic injustices. And until we as white people understand that difference and stop becoming defensive, we're not going to be able to be part of the solution, which we are really primarily responsible for.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you mentioned is that, because we are explicit in the racism and white supremacy, we sort of, one of the things that we consider is that, we think of racism as being sort of a crime of intent, like we intended to hurt somebody, but it isn't, right? A lot of the things that we do, we have very good intentions. And that instead what's happening is that we have unconscious biases that we don't even necessarily see because of the way that we were raised and the cultures that we were raised in and the things we heard growing up. That unconsciously we have accumulated a lot of ideas and feelings that then result in us favoring people who look like us. And that isn't something where we're intending to hurt people, but it does hurt people because we are acting in ways that are blind and unfair. And this is true of any type of power that we have. This is true of financial power. This is true of social power. Anybody can have unconscious bias. But what makes something racism or white supremacy is that it's institutional, like that because white people are in places of power and because systems were created largely for and by and in behalf of white people, these unconscious biases have become systemic. They have become a part of our laws. They have become a part of our cultural norms. They have become a part of our institutions. And we are often blind to those facts. And it doesn't, and the way that this affects sort of our mental health is that when it is pointed out to us that like we are a part of a system that oppresses people, we often like want to protect our identity of being a good person. And that is one of the things that gets in the way of fixing the problem, because we're so caught up in wanting to be seen as, and just because we want to be good, and that's a good thing that we want to be good, but acknowledging that sometimes our attachment to our idea of our own goodness is the thing that gets in the way of us doing the work to make life better for people who don't look like us. And that is very specifically some hard mental health work to do, because it requires like really doing some deep work of looking at the ways that we build our identities and the way we defend our identities. And that's work you cannot do in isolation, right? Like you have to have support, either, you know, like communities or mental health workers who can walk with you through unraveling the ways that you are blind to your behaviors and defending your identity.
Yeah, and it's so easy to see it even on social media feeds and kind of these polarizations that happen that, you know, a lot of times maybe are done with well intent, but again, come from an uneducated space about privilege and white supremacy. Like a very common thing we see is all lives matter, you know, so kind of this sentiment that, well, yes, Black lives matter, but isn't it true that all lives matter? And I'm being benevolent because I care about everybody, you know, or I'm colorblind, you know, I don't see color because I'm not racist, right? So I'm not going to treat people the same. And that's what I'm trying to say with those kinds of statements. With those kinds of statements are unfortunately, they're actually exacerbating privilege and white supremacy, because it ignores the voice of the Black or brown you know, the Black or brown people who are stating, actually, my experience is very different than your lived experience. And although that's maybe a nice idea, it's not an idea that's applicable to our current situation. You know, if we had an equal system, then we can talk about how all lives matter. But when we don't have an equal system, then that's actually a very dismissive statement. And I see white people getting very defensive because I think they're saying those things, trying to show how they're not racist, and yet they're being called out that actually that is a racist type of sentiment. And then we get caught in these white fragility moments where instead of really addressing the problem, we're all caught up in our own discomfort and our own guilt and shame that I think sometimes the white community doesn't know how to talk about, the fact that we come from the ancestors that were very much a part of creating these systems to begin with, and that these systems pervade, that we're not, our work is not done by any means.
Indeed.
Yes, indeed. And one of the things that Dr. Misha McGriggs said yesterday, which I really appreciate, was just this one statement. You know, she's like, the denouncing and the taking apart of white supremacy is white folks' work. That's our work. It's not Black and brown people's work to take down these oppressive systems. Their work is to heal from those oppressive systems. And so what's challenging for us as white people to move into that space is that, again, unless it's broadcast into our social media feeds, most of us don't live those experiences. So it's not in our conscious day-to-day lived experience. So it's very easy to think racism is done. We're done, right? We're done with racism because we don't live it. We don't have the same experiences. We don't have an extra level of fear when the police stops us. We don't have certain levels of decision-making about when we go places and how we go places and in what settings we're going to be. And we don't have the microaggressions that are coming at us on a regular basis about our color or our status. So this means that we as a white community need to be actually intentional. It can't just be something that, oh, now I'm going to notice. We're probably not going to notice it. So we have to step into that intentional space of, oh, because I don't notice this, I probably need to actually do things I wouldn't normally do in order to help address this.
Right. And that means putting yourself in situations where you feel really uncomfortable. And I think that this was one of the hardest lessons I had to learn, sort of like as a blogger and community leader, was that, you know, especially coming from a Mormon background where being nice and making everybody comfortable was like a cultural priority. Like we should try and make everybody comfortable. But we weren't really talking about everybody. We were talking about sort of the majority. Let's make sure that the majority is comfortable. And the result of that was that there were people who were not in the majority for a variety of reasons who were very uncomfortable. And we would prioritize the comfort of the many over the comfort of the few. And that is something that I think white communities are often very, very blind to, that we want everybody to get along. And that means that we're going to silence the voices of people that are coming in saying there's something wrong here, because that makes people uncomfortable, right? And so that, again, is difficult mental health work to do, is starting to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, because that's necessary. Like if we are going to do the work to make this a more fair system for everyone, that means we have to do a lot of work of getting really comfortable with feeling uncomfortable. And that sounds a little bit like, what? You know, like what? How? But it's not just, I mean, and that's work that isn't just good for anti-racism work. It's good for anti-patriarchy work. It's also good just for like learning to sit in our own emotions and the hard things in our own lives, right? Like that's something I have to do with clients for many, many reasons, is teaching clients to be comfortable with our discomfort and learning not to prioritize the comfort of the comfortable, but rather prioritize the, you know, like making a space for people whose voices haven't been heard and making them feel like they can speak up and voice the ways in which we haven't heard them in the past.
Yeah, no, I really like that. And I think if we were going to lay out kind of like a very generic treatment plan for racism in the white community, you know, like we would for anybody coming into our office for whatever issue they're coming in for, I think that's a good way to think about it. You know, I think the first goal is to just acknowledge the problem. I think for a lot of us, it's hard to just acknowledge the problem for a lot of the reasons that we've mentioned. You know, we can get defensive. We don't want to look at kind of the dark underbelly of this. It's not our lived experience, so we just assume everybody's experience is kind of similar to ours. And so being able to acknowledge, I probably don't totally get this. I'm probably part of the problem in ways that I don't recognize. And that doesn't make me a bad person. That makes me part of a system that is bigger than me. And even though it's bigger than me, I can have an impact in my social and community circles that can be part of the solution. So that, I would say, would probably be goal number one. Then goal number two is, I think some of what you're talking about is learning emotional regulation around this. You know, just because we've acknowledged we have a problem doesn't mean that that in of itself fixes it. We have to then start doing the emotional work. So this is where I would say, educate yourselves, read books, listen to Black voices, listen to Black community leaders and therapists, and what are they saying about these things, and pastors, etc. Go to a cultural diversity class. You know, there's one that Misha is offering online, and there's several other people who are doing similar things. talk to your Black friends and brown friends about this. Really listen from a space of curiosity and listening and empathy, instead of just, trying to pretend that stuff doesn't exist between the two of you. All of those kinds of things. And then the third part, which is kind of, I think, what I'd like to talk to you about, is once we're in a space where we've boosted our resilience, because quite frankly, we need to get more resilient as white people and being able to address these issues. Then we can actually do actions that are quite different in how we actually show up in the world and live our lives. What do you want to say about that?
Well, I mean, I feel like this is really, like you said, kind of the next step, because I feel like right now we're really having big conversations about learning to listen to people of color, speaking out when you see injustice. And those are like really good, like great conversations to have, and that needs to happen insofar as that hasn't been happening, right? And it's not enough, right? Like, the truth is that when you have an institutionalized system that oppresses people, you have to give up stuff that you really like, including being comfortable, but also like financial things and privilege things, right? Like, this means that we have to really start doing some deep work with sort of our spiritual nature and our desires and our wants, and like questioning some of our actions, right? Like, are we buying homes in all white neighborhoods because it'll get us in a better school district where our kids won't be around brown people? Like, that is a hard thing to do, to like question our choice to give our kids a privilege, because we feel so strongly about giving our kids the best. But, like, as long as we as white people stay focused like that on making sure that our kids get the best, we are reinforcing that other people's kids aren't. And that is real. Like, that is real. And that's the same with like who gets paid. Like, are we willing to get paid a little less or not get a promotion if that means a person of color does? And right, like, that brings up a lot of feelings. That's really hard to face. But if we don't face it, if we don't like do these actions and be willing to give up some of our privilege, then we're really stopping short of doing the hard stuff that can actually change the system.
The systemic part of it, right? And this goes to all kinds of things. What leaders we elect, what policies are we, maybe privileged by, and therefore vote certain ways, instead of voting ways that maybe don't always privilege our position. Like you said, the communities that we engage in, where do we live? Where do our kids go to school? Where do we spend our volunteer efforts? What boards are we a part of? If we are on all white boards, or if we notice that the leadership in our companies or in our churches are all white, what are we doing to challenge that? What are we doing to change and show more diversity in the spaces that we're in? For example, like, I've been thinking about that from day one at Symmetry Solutions. We are all white providers. Mental health as a whole has been talking about this for the last 20 years that I've been in mental health associations. How do we help there be more therapists that are brown and Black, in our community? It's an overall issue. And then in my niche of the world, which is Mormon, it's even more of an issue, right? So it's very hard to have access to those kinds of, but I'm thinking of that and trying to shift and see how I can change that. All kinds of things like that. So it's like our finances, our parenting, our communities, our volunteer work, our church communities, our work environments. If we're in any position of leadership, if you're a banker, if you're in the banking and financial institutions, like, how are we going to do our parts? And I think a lot of it will have to happen through policy and through political kind of means, but we can't wait for those kinds of things to happen before we're looking at all of our own areas of influence and what kinds of things can we be doing to shift into those invitations that you're talking about. Would you add anything else to my treatment plan?
I'm sure there's many things that we have missed because of our privilege, but I mean, I think that that's a good starting place and that we are going to keep trying.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we don't want differences of opinion or those feelings of defensiveness. A lot of times when we're feeling defensive, when we're feeling like I thought I was doing something right, but then I got pushback, it can be really easy in those moments to just say, well, then never mind. You know, I'm not willing to engage. I'm not willing to take the risk of stepping on toes or in doing it wrong. So I'm just not going to do anything. And those of us who are white, if that's the direction we go, we are again complicitly moving back into a space. We have the ability to move it back and not do anything because it doesn't affect us. That's a privilege. It's a privilege to be defensive, you know, to get offended and then say, I'm not going to do anything because yeah, okay, I can not do anything about it, but my life isn't affected by that while other people's lives are. So I just would really encourage people to, even if you have said the wrong thing, even if you have gotten pushback, even if you had to eat, you know, you have to eat some humble pie, which I think we all do. Let's just do that. And let's just keep the momentum going. We'll get it right eventually. I hope that's the hope we have.
So can I push back on that a little bit? Yes, because I feel like one of the things I really struggled with myself when I first started doing this work was that feeling of I can never win and I can never do it right. And I kind of feel like that attitude in and of itself is problematic, because if we're waiting for a time when we can do it right, or waiting for a time when we can win, right? Like, and I don't know that that is a destination we can get to. Like, I feel like it's an asymptote, like you can get closer and closer, but you're never going to get there, right? Like there isn't any winning and there isn't any right, because even when we do something, quote, wrong and somebody pushes back, it's not like there is some institution out there that says this is the right thing to do about racism, right? Like there's just as much disunity in that as anything else, just because like, this is hard stuff and nobody really knows, right? But over time, the more we try, the closer that asymptote gets. And we, and we can also sort of, I don't know, I guess I don't feel like I get to the hope so much that someday I'll do it right, so much as come to peace with myself in just doing it wrong better and better. Or something.
I like that. Right. That's exactly right. Doing it wrong better and better. And especially when we are in a position of white privilege, that's just going to be the reality, because we don't know the lived experience. We don't know the story. We don't live it. And so we're going to do our best, and our best is sometimes not going to come across well, or we've missed something, or we have, there's other things that need to be addressed. So it's an ongoing battle. And so how do we do that in a way where we don't retreat, because retreating is a privilege, and yet we continue to learn and educate and push forward. And we also pause at times for self-care, because unless you're doing somewhat well yourself, you're not gonna be able to do good work. And have communities that can support you, have people that you trust that have some expertise in these areas, be a critical thinker. Sometimes it's very easy. One of the things that I think is very easy to do is to surround ourselves with people who already think like we do. It's called confirmation bias, right? So if you're surrounded by a bunch of people who think all lives matter is a great quote, maybe push yourself to listen to some different voices, and why they might have a different perspective than that. So we want to, I think those are my suggestions. I don't know if you have any closing thoughts, Lisa.
I have many feelings and no thoughts at all in my head right now.
Yeah. It's a tender time for everybody, as it should be. As it should be. And I'm glad that we're having to face I think somebody in our meeting today said sometimes it's sad that oftentimes it takes tragedy in order for movement to happen. And that's definitely the case here. It's really tragic that it takes consistent tragedy for movement to happen. But I am very pleased to see the international really movement around this. And I hope the momentum continues, right? That we don't just get to the next news story next week and everything just kind of dies down again. That this will be a consistent, continued movement towards ways that we need to improve for the betterment of all, but in particular of our Black and Brown members of our community. So thank you, Lisa, for your time today.
Thank you, Natasha.
We welcome, of course, feedback. We especially welcome feedback from people of color. We're perfectly fine being called out for anything, so feel free to give us that feedback as well. And we are, like I said at the beginning, we are committed to, at least in our lane, do what we can to educate not only ourselves and to continue the dialogue from a clinical perspective, but also do what we can with our constituents and our clients and people who we have influence with. So that's what we are committed to. Have a good day, everybody. Take care.
Bye.